Hello and welcome. I'm Sima Katauka and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. Brigitte Bardot's coffin arrives at a church in Saint-Tropez on Wednesday at the start of a ceremony for the French screen icon who died last month of cancer. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian orders security forces not to crack down on economic protests, drawing a distinction between peaceful demonstrators and armed riots. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung says he has urged Chinese leader Xi Jinping to help him curb Pyongyang's nuclear program and suggested a freeze in its development of weapons of mass destruction was feasible with the right conditions. Trump says Venezuela will turn over 50 million barrels of oil. U.S. crude futures fell 1.3% to $56.39 per barrel after the announcement. White House says U.S. discusses range of options to acquire Greenland, including use of military. Trump says he has a good relationship with Indian Prime Minister Modi, but he highlighted Modi's displeasure over 50% U.S. tariffs on Indian linked to Russian oil purchases. He warned tariffs could rise further if India does not address Washington's concerns. China is reviewing Meta's $2 billion purchase of AI firm Manus over possible technology export control issues, a move that could give Beijing leverage over the deal. NVIDIA's CEO confirms that China won't make any formal announcement about approving imports of NVIDIA's A200 chips. Now we start this hour with US. The United States is pressuring Venezuela's interim government to expel advisors from China, Russia, Cuba, and Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has conveyed these demands to Venezuela's new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, during a classified meeting with senior congressional leaders. The U.S. wants intelligence and military personnel from these countries removed, though some diplomats may stay. This move comes after a U.S. operation led to the capture of former President Nicolas Maduro. Rubio has also urged Rodriguez to reopen oil trade with the U.S., which could involve relaxing Venezuela's oil nationalization policies. Venezuela's interim government is balancing its sovereignty while responding to U.S. demands, and Rodriguez faces a difficult task as tensions remain high. The United States is pressuring Venezuela's interim government to expel advisors from China, Russia, Cuba, and Iran. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has conveyed these demands to Venezuela's new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, during a classified meeting with senior congressional leaders. The U.S. wants intelligence and military personnel from these countries be removed, though some diplomats may stay. This move comes after a U.S. operation led to the capture of former President Nicolas Maduro. Rubio also has urged Rodriguez to reopen oil trade with the U.S., which could involve relaxing Venezuela's oil nationalization policies. Venezuela's interim government is balancing its sovereignty while responding to U.S. demands. Now for this discussion, we welcome Professor Andy Latham. He's an international affairs expert, joins us live from Minneapolis. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us once again. Good to see you. Now looking at this, why is U.S. pressuring Venezuela to remove advisors from China, Russia, Cuba, and Iran in particular?
Well, that, in my judgment, was the entire motivation for this military action. It wasn't about stopping narco trafficking. It wasn't about grabbing Venezuelan oil or critical minerals. It's always, first and foremost, been about bringing Venezuela back into the American-dominated Western Hemisphere sphere of influence. And that means reducing or ending the strategic ties between Venezuela and China, Venezuela and Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and Venezuela and Iran, all of which have been multiplying over the last 2 decades. And that is something that this administration and indeed the foreign policy establishment, I think, in Washington simply finds unacceptable. That's the real motive behind this action, and this, in that sense, isn't surprising at all.
And what do you think, well, we can only speculate here, but what pressure do you think Rodriguez faces now, and what choices she's got other than abiding by this pressure by US?
Well, she's going to face pressures from the United States, obviously. Trump has already threatened her. He's taking a carrot and stick approach, threats and possible rewards. But at home, she's going to face, there are factions within the regime. There are some that are very committed to Chavismo, or the Chavista political ideology, and they are not going to be interested in doing what the United States wants. They're going to be interested in maintaining those strategic ties with China and Russia in particular. And then there are others within the regime who are more amenable. They just want their pockets to be filled. They don't really particularly care about the political ideology that legitimizes and justifies that. And if this means kowtowing to the United States, then that's what they will do. And so within the regime, there are going to be these cross currents, these competing pressures on her, Rodriguez. And it remains to be seen which way she goes. My guess at this point is that she will go along with American demands, because there's a future there for her within the regime, and there's a future for the regime within Venezuela, and there's a future for Venezuela within the Western Hemisphere.
So if that does happen, what about the regime's relationship with those countries like Cuba, Iran, and the four countries?
Yeah, it's going to sour very quickly. I mean, we need to be clear that the relationship with Russia is mostly about weapons and oil. The Russian weapons proved to be absolutely useless against American weapons in the raid. Not one American aircraft was shot down, not one American service member was even wounded. Completely useless. So that's not much of a loss. The oil market, with respect to both China and Russia, that can be made up elsewhere. There's a lot of demand for oil on the world market, so I'm not worried. They wouldn't be worried about that. What they will worry about, I think, is the amount of infrastructural investment that they get from China, that would end. And that would have to be made up elsewhere. And so that's an opportunity for the United States to step in and say, we will invest in your oil infrastructure. We'll invest in the rest of your economic infrastructure. And Trump has already made sounds to that effect. I wouldn't call them promises, but sort of commitments to that effect, that the American private sector would step in and fill the vacuum created when the Chinese investors were forced to withdraw. So those are the winners and losers, the pluses and minuses of this. And now Rodriguez has to balance this all out against her own personal fate within the regime and make some decisions.
Right. Thank you for highlighting that, Professor Latham. Please stay with us as we come back to you. Now we stay in this topic. Oil prices have dropped today after President Donald Trump announced a deal to import $2 billion of Venezuelan crude, boosting U.S. supply. Brent fell 29 cents to $60.41, and WTI fell 44 cents to $56.69. The agreement could reroute cargoes originally bound for China, adding to a global oversupply already expected in 2026. Venezuela's Mary crude trades roughly $22 below Brent, making it an inexpensive option. Analysts warn that increased Venezuelan exports could depress prices further and delay investment in U.S. production. Morgan Stanley projects a potential 3 million BPD surplus in early 2026 due to weak demand and rising output. Chevron remains the main exporter from Venezuela under U.S. authorization. While U.S. crude inventories recently fell by 2.77 million barrels, fuel stockpiles rose. Trump has emphasized he would control sales revenue to benefit both countries, signaling a preference for higher supply over price management. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Professor Andrew Latham. He's an international affairs expert, joins us live from Minneapolis. Thank you very much, Professor, for staying with us. Now, how will this, the oil surplus in U.S. in particular will be changing the trajectory of entire globe's oil business? And also, what happens now with US and Middle East, particularly in with Saudi, Qatar, the relationship which seemed like it was thawing after Trump took office? What will happen to their relationship?
Well, there's going to be some turbulence in the markets in the short to medium term. The Venezuelan oil industry requires a lot of investment in infrastructural reconstruction so that they can actually get the oil out of the ground and either refine it locally or ship it to where it can be refined. That's not going to happen overnight. There is some production that's taking place, and to the extent that the United States relaxes, which it will, its sanctions against Venezuelan oil, that is going to get onto the market, and the laws of supply and demand will kick in, and so prices will go down. One of the big losers here is not so much the Saudis, but the Russians, who rely on income from their oil exports to fund their war and indeed their government. And if the price of oil were to drop considerably, seriously, significantly, that's going to have an impact on their war-making ability. But it's also going to affect American friends. It's also going to affect the American oil industry. But I think in Trump's mind, first and foremost, it's going to affect the American consumer. Prices at the gas pump are going to go down. Maybe right away. Maybe it'll take a little while for this to work its way through the market. But that's, I think, what he's counting on, that this is going to impact the Republican Party's prospects at the upcoming midterms, and ensure that the Republicans remain in power in both the House and the Senate. And if it puts pressure on Putin to strike some kind of deal over Ukraine, that would be an added benefit as well.
Thank you. With that, I would like to thank Mr. Professor Andrew Latham for joining us today and sharing that insight throughout our news. Thank you very much. Now we move the focus on to Middle East. An Israeli-backed Palestinian militia has said that it has killed 2 Hamas operatives in southern Gaza in a raid in Rafah and retained a third. The group, known as the Popular Forces, is led by Ghassan Duhine and has been gaining recruits since an October Israel-Hamas deal. Hamas has declined to comment, and the claim could not be independently verified. These emerging groups operate under Israeli control and add pressure to Hamas, which still holds most of Gaza and commands thousands of men despite wartime losses. Israel has acknowledged backing anti-Hamas clans to counter Hamas in territory it controls. An Israeli-backed Palestinian militia says it has killed 2 Hamas operatives in southern Gaza in a raid in Rafah and detained a third. The group, known as the Popular Forces, is led by Ghassan Duhine and has been gaining recruits since October Israel-Hamas deal. Now for this discussion, we welcome Mr. Mohammed Osman. He's an international relations expert, joins us live from Cairo. Thank you very much, Mr. Osman, for joining us once again. Good to see you. Now, looking at this, can you tell us a little bit about how is Israel, now that Israel has acknowledged backing anti-Hamas clans within Palestine or within Gaza, how is this changing or shaping the politics over there, and how is Hamas countering it, and is it effective, this this plan of Israel to make anti-Hamas clans to counter Hamas in Gaza?
Thank you for having me, Asuma. Always a pleasure to be with you as usual.
Thank you.
It seems that Israel is fomenting dissent, sedition, and even civil war inside the Gaza Strip at this moment. Israel has been working relentlessly since this fire went into effect in order to derail it, or at least empty it of its actual meaning and its actual purpose, by basically completely maiming and disfiguring the implementation process of the first phase of the ceasefire, which witnessed hundreds upon hundreds of Israeli violations, if not thousands of Israeli violations, that have left within the span of about 10 weeks about 500 Palestinians dead, and we are speaking about a ceasefire, Asuma. So 500 died during a ceasefire, most of them civilians. We have seen Israel again putting constraints upon the entry of aid, Israel rejecting and blocking the reopening of the the Rafah border crossing between Gaza and Egypt, Israel refusing to withdraw its troops or redeploy its troops even inside to further lines eastwards in the Gaza Strip, and at the same time they are propping up anti-Hamas militants and clans and gangs, criminal gangs, basically to counter Hamas's influence, which is causing a degree of insecurity and civil conflict inside an already war-torn Gaza Strip. 80% of the basic infrastructure of the Gaza Strip has been destroyed, as we all know. And what Israel desires to achieve by undertaking such policies is basically to make sure that the Trump plan cannot be applied in full. President Trump has been pushing the Netanyahu government, and we have seen that during the Trump-Netanyahu summit in Mar-a-Lago a few days or last week, that the Americans really want to proceed to phase 2 of the Trump peace plan in Gaza. However, this will be rendered impossible, or at least they would proceed to it without actually applying most of it because of the realities Israel is imposing on the ground, Assume.
Right. So now how do you, after, Mar-a-Lago summit of President Trump and Netanyahu, how do you see their alignment? Are they aligned closely in, do they agree on everything in relations to moving on to phase 2 in Gaza?
They have their disagreements, of course. However, I would not see that they are not completely unaligned, as some would imagine, because the media tends sometimes to exaggerate the differences and the disagreements between Netanyahu and Trump, which are basically not true. Netanyahu knows how to deal with Trump. He knows how to contain Trump, basically, and at least give him the illusion that he is doing what Trump wants, basically. So when it comes to Gaza, he told him, okay, I will proceed to phase 2 and maybe redeploy and allow early recovery and the entry of the humanitarian aid and the opening of the Rafah border crossing. However, this all depends on two things: the return of the last corpse of one of the remaining hostages inside the Gaza Strip, and he is missing, and they have not been able to find him because Israel basically is blocking the entry of many of the reconstruction equipment from getting into Gaza in order to be able to excavate the ground to find that body. And also they put another condition there, and that is the total disarmament of Hamas. And this is where the actual thorny part of the issue lies, because the agreement never said that there should be an immediate disarmament of Hamas. However, Trump now is leaning towards Israel's point of view, and according to reports, they have communicated, both the Americans and the Israelis, a 2-month ultimatum to Hamas that they should disarm within those 2 months, or Israel will be required to take the necessary actions in order to disarm what remains of Hamas, which is basically sliding back into war potentially, because Hamas will never agree to this arrangement. Of course, on the other hand, the other mediators like Turkey, Egypt, and Qatar, and the other Muslim and Arab nations are trying to pressure the United States and urge the United States into applying more pressure on the Israelis so that the agreement might be implemented, and that the American position might be more flexible on the idea of the disarmament of Hamas. This seems distant. I think that Trump really cares about when it comes to Gaza, Asuma, is freezing the conflict and not necessarily resolving the conflict in Gaza. So as long as the conflict is frozen and is out of the news cycle, and there are no daily massacres, but the killings of 100 and 200 people daily, mostly civilians, he's okay with that. And Israel, of course, will have to undertake its designs and plans to depopulate the Gaza Strip and acquire more land, Palestinian land, in a more gradual, subtle way than the genocidal manner that they were adopting earlier when the war was active in full force, Asuma.
Thank you for highlighting that. And Mr. Osman, lastly, if disarming Hamas is the priority for Israel, but of course, realistically, it looks almost impossible to me, at least, that disarming Hamas right now And also Hamas regaining momentum and support and rearming and realigning their troops or their spokesperson, etc. We saw in last few weeks. It seems like it's very unlikely. So what would that look like if Hamas continues to hold ground and of course Israel and US is not able to disarm Hamas?
We will see more targeting of Hamas in case Hamas refuses completely to disarm. Unfortunately, the probability of Gaza sliding back into open warfare will be more possible, unfortunately. I don't think that the Israelis will be able to offer any compromises or make any concessions with regards to the arms of Hamas. I think the Americans, even though they were willing at the beginning to adhere to certain frameworks for the gradual disarmament of Hamas, which Hamas, by the way, was ready to interact with and still is ready, according to many sources and even my sources, that they are ready to interact positively with, even though they do not say that publicly. However, at the same time, to the Israelis, this arrangement is not suitable. They want the immediate disarmament of Hamas, which is farcical, assuming, to be honest, because what are you going to disarm? Most of the actual weapons, heavy weapons of Hamas, were destroyed during the war. The rockets, the mortars, the heavy weapons, the landmines, most of these equipment have been destroyed. What is left is a few rifles and a few guns. Even Netanyahu said that they still have 60,000 rifles that they have to turn in. By the way, most of the people of Gaza are armed, not only Hamas, and this is the culture of that part of the world. So basically there's a rifle or a gun or a pistol inside every household in Gaza. How are you going to disarm more than 2 million people? So the idea that the Israelis are using the card of disarmament to prolong the current state of affairs in Gaza, it's not because they really want to disarm Hamas, assume. It is because they want to block any attempts to renormalize life in Gaza, to block any attempts for early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza, or any form of Palestinian governance in Gaza for that matter. What they want is for the humanitarian catastrophe to persist and even deepen, so that the people of Gaza will have no other choice but to leave. And already they are facilitating for hundreds of families who have already left the Gaza Strip through Israeli ports and airports and over the past few weeks. And Israel is betting that they can facilitate the so-called voluntary departure, which is, of course, a form of ethnic cleansing of the people of Gaza through their ports, especially after Egypt blocked the possibility of the forced displacement of the Palestinians into its territory.
Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Osman. Please stay with us as we stay in this region. Now, Hamas, along with the Red Cross, has reportedly resumed the search for the remains of Police Master Sergeant Ran Vili in Gaza City's eastern Zaytun neighborhood. He is the last remaining hostage to be returned to Israel. According to Palestine media reports, the search appears limited to Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam Brigades, and does not include the Al-Quds Brigades of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Meanwhile, Israel has publicly stated that it will not be moving forward with the next phase of the Gaza ceasefire until Vili's remains are returned. Returning the bodies of 28 Israeli hostages was a key element of the October 10th ceasefire agreed between Israel and Hamas last year. Now, for this discussion, we welcome back Mr. Mohammed Osman. He's an international relations expert, joins us live from Cairo. As you know, you were just highlighting that in last discussion, the Hamas was ready to is ready to interact with Israel, but Israel seems to have other motives, not just disarming of Hamas, and to stop any form of governance over there. So is this part of their strategy to elongate finding this last remaining hostage's body as well?
Yes, indeed they are doing that. I think that the Israelis are basically obstructing the effort to search and retrieve the body of the last hostage, because basically they are blocking and obstructing sometimes the entry of the Red Cross. They are obstructing the entry of reconstruction equipment like bulldozers and other things that are used to dig the ground to find those this dead hostage. And at the same time, they undertake daily attacks on several parts of the Gaza Strip. They attack the northern Gaza and the Gaza City area. They bombard parts of Khan Yunis that are beyond the yellow line, and they are even moving the yellow line. At the beginning of the ceasefire, Asuma, Israel controlled 53% of Gaza. Now they control about 58%, nearly 60% of Gaza, which means there's a moving front line during a ceasefire, something that is absolutely unheard of. A ceasefire where one side gets to shoot, and also that same side gets to move the front line forward and advance. You see how farcical and laughable this has become, and sad at the same time. This has become, Asuma, this is Israel's demented, sick definition of what a ceasefire is, and the United States is enabling that. And at the same time, they need to maintain this reality on the ground, this situation on the ground, but the only way by which they can maintain it is through finding pretexts. What are the pretexts? Delay the retrieving of the body of a hostage, that he can always be used as a pretext to carry out more aggressive measures and impede the implementation of the agreement. Say that Hamas must be disarmed immediately and without haste, and pressure the United States into taking that position. Therefore, the application of the agreement is made further unapplicable and implausible. So this is what the Israelis are doing, and at the same time, they are not crossing the red line by reopening the war again as an open conflict or an all-out conflict, because they respect President Trump's red line. President Trump does not want more massacres in Gaza and does not want to see Gaza as an active conflict zone anymore. He sees that this is a waste of American foreign policy resources and that he has to pay attention to other venues. And we have seen that.
Yes.
Once the war in the Middle East stopped, he went ahead and tried to mediate the war in Ukraine. He went ahead and struck Venezuela and abducted its president. So you see that any calm in the Middle East gives the United States a more free hand to raise trouble in other parts of the world.
Yes, indeed, very enlightening. Thank you. With that, I would like to thank Mr. Mohammed Osman for joining us from Cairo and sharing that insight throughout our news. Thank you very much. Now we move the focus on to Ethiopia. At least 22 migrants have been killed and dozens more injured after a lorry carrying them overturned in northeastern Ethiopia. Authorities say the crash happened in the town of Samira in the Afar region. About 85 Ethiopian migrants were traveling on the so-called Eastern Migration Route when the vehicle lost control and flipped. Officials confirmed 65 people were injured, several of them very seriously. The migrants' final destination was not clear, but the route is commonly used by people leaving Ethiopia in search of work in the Middle East. It typically passes through Djibouti, across the Red Sea, to Yemen, and onward to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries. Yemen remains a key transit point for migrants from the Horn of Africa, despite ongoing conflict and extreme dangers along the journey. Authorities say an investigation into the crash is underway. Now we move on to our next news. Samsung Electronics has announced that it will be buying back 2.5 trillion won or $1.73 billion worth of its own shares for employee and executive compensation. The purchases will be made on the stock market between January 8th and April 7th as part of a performance-linked compensation scheme introduced in October 2025. The move highlights Samsung's efforts to reward employees while managing its capital strategy and shareholder value. The company filed the plan with regulators and said it would be implemented according to market conditions. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.